Welcome to the Unsolved Mystery YouTube channel and our exclusive series JonBenét's Web Truths. On this evening's episode we will be featuring the November 2nd, 2015 released Investigation Discovery, JonBenet Ramsey case premiere episode of Barbara Walters' American Scandals. But as we do, without any further ado, let's get right into this.
When I committed adultery, I did these things.
I'm asking you.
Just a normal kid.
You're a normal kid who killed your parents.
Her image still haunts us. JonBenet Ramsey, a child beauty pageant queen and the victim of a brutal murder. The police suspected her parents.
I knew what happened to her.
Barbara Walters asked them the tough questions back then.
What we saw was a child dressed like an adult. To many people, this looks perverted.
There is something wrong here if someone thinks that looks perverted.
Did either of you have anything to do with the death of your daughter?
But now there are new questions. Did the police bungle the investigation? Did the press rush to judgment?
Police went to the court of public opinion, and that started a tidal wave in which the public started to believe that the Ramseys were guilty.
Why wasn't the case ever solved? And Barbara Walters' interview with John Ramsey today.
We have to have hope.
The real story of an American scandal.
The murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey captured the public's imagination as much as any crime I've ever covered. The child beauty pageants, the angelic child herself, her brutal murder. It all added up to a mix that was both poignant and horrifying.
Hello, I'm Patsy Ramsey, and we'd like to welcome you to our home and wish you a very Merry Christmas.
The Ramsey family loved Christmas. They lined their walk with candy canes. They put Christmas trees in all the rooms. There were piles of presents for Burke and JonBenet.
What'd you get, JonBenet? Oh!
Christmas 1996 was especially busy for the Ramsey family. John's business had passed the $1 billion mark in sales. There was a press release and a party. JonBenet, who competed in beauty pageants, had performed in public several times. And the Ramseys had thrown a big party for the children in the neighborhood, complete with a Santa Claus. But that Christmas in 1996 would be JonBenet's last. On Christmas Day, the Ramseys had been out of the house visiting friends. They got home around 9 o'clock and put the children, Burke and JonBenet, to bed on the second floor. When Patsy woke up the next morning around 5:30, she found the ransom note. "We have your daughter in our possession. If you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter."
The ransom note said, "Don't call the police or your daughter is gone." And of course, the first thing they did is call the police.
Do you know how long she's been gone?
No, I don't. Please, we just got up and she's not here. Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, there's somebody.
I am, honey.
A police officer arrived at the Ramseys at 6 a.m. He searched the house, the bedrooms, the kitchen, the basement. Nothing seemed out of place. The Ramseys called their friends for emotional support, and the house was soon full of people. More police officers arrived. One of them noticed that there were no intruders' footprints in the snow. The ransom note said the kidnapper would call between 8 and 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock came and went. No phone call. John Ramsey did not seem to react to the missed deadline. The police thought that was odd. At 1 o'clock, the police asked John and one of his friends to look around for anything unusual. In the basement, John opened the door to a small storage room. It was dark, but he thought he saw something. John turned on the light. There was JonBenet's body. She was wrapped in a white blanket. When John touched her, she was cold and stiff. He rushed upstairs with the body and laid JonBenet on the floor in front of the Christmas tree. Police officer Linda Arndt checked JonBenet's pulse. Nothing.
He asked if she was dead. And I said, yes, she's dead. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. I knew what happened to her.
Linda Arndt felt sure that John Ramsey had killed his daughter. The police cleared the house of people and declared it a crime scene. Then detectives discovered something interesting about the ransom note.
The paper that was used on the ransom note was actually torn from a pad in the house.
If the killer had planned to kidnap JonBenet, wouldn't he have brought the note with him? There was something else odd about the note. It asked for $118,000, the same amount that John had just received as his year-end bonus. The detectives were also puzzled by the blanket JonBenet's body had been wrapped in. It had come from the dryer in the Ramsey home.
And that led police to believe that it was an inside job, because where this blanket had been stored, where it had been kept, was really known to very few people.
The police officers saw other signs of an inside job. There were no indications of forced entry. So how had the killer gotten in? And why hadn't John or Patsy awakened during the night when JonBenet was taken to the basement?
But if somebody's going to take her from the bed, well, this child's going to scream and holler, as she's being dragged somewhere else in the house. Or did she go willingly with a member of the family?
The detectives on the case were taken aback when the Ramseys hired criminal defense attorneys only 2 days after the murder. The police asked them to come in for questioning, but for months they refused.
If a mother's child has been murdered, and the family is grieving, why wouldn't you want to cooperate with the police?
To nearly every officer on the case, one thing was clear. John and Patsy Ramsey were involved in murdering their daughter. It was just a local story at first. Then 4 days after her death, one of the beauty pageants that JonBenet competed in released video to the media, and a local photographer who had shot JonBenet in a variety of costumes at Patsy's request sold those photos to the tabloids. Now it was national news.
In Colorado today, the mystery of the little girl found strangled in the basement of her house. There's a certain amount of journalistic oxygen you need. One of them is pictures. And you had these photographs and you had that video. You show me any story about JonBenet Ramsey that didn't include the pictures, and, I'll eat my hat. It just didn't happen.
The public was shocked at the images of JonBenet dressed provocatively, and people wondered what kind of parents the Ramseys were. In an attempt to improve their public image, the Ramseys decided to do an interview on CNN 6 days after the murder.
If anyone knows anything, please help us.
I think the Ramseys should not have done the interview with CNN. You're going to do an interview with CNN, but you're not going to do an interview with the police? You're going to lawyer up and cooperate with the media on your own terms, but you're not going to help the police find the killer of your children?
Subsequent public appearances were no better.
Yes, they did hold a press conference one. Yes, Patsy did hold up a little poster, that they're looking for the killer. Yes, she did cry on camera, but it didn't feel real. It felt like it was all staged, like a corporative plan.
To those of you who may want to ask, let me address very directly, I did not kill my daughter, JonBenet. I think in John Ramsey's case, he seemed lacking demonstrative emotion, whereas Patsy seemed almost a bit too florid. And people thought, there's something strange there.
The autopsy showed a brutal murder. JonBenet had been hit so hard, it cracked her skull nearly open. She'd been strangled with a rope so viciously that it was embedded in her skin. And she had been sexually molested. The police believed that John had been abusing JonBenet and had killed her to cover it up. Or that in a fit of anger, Patsy had struck JonBenet, killing her, and then covered up the crime with John's help. Despite police requests, the Ramseys said they would only talk on their own terms. But the police thought they could pressure the Ramseys into cooperating, and they used the media to do it.
Sources in stories like this are cops and prosecutors. In Colorado, whether you're a local reporter or whether you're someone who comes in on a national case, what do you do first? You talk to the cops. What do the cops think? Well, the cops think, to some degree, that these people require a bit more pressure. So you report what the cops tell you.
The police at this point are not ruling anybody out?
The police went to the court of public opinion. They leaked so much of the evidence that they thought was against the Ramseys, and that started a tidal wave in which the public started to believe that the Ramseys were guilty.
Within a week of John Bonet's murder, the police, the press, and much of the public believed that John and Patsy Ramsey had been involved in their daughter's murder. If they had killed her, they were monsters. But what if they hadn't killed her? It took only a week for the Boulder police to become convinced that John and Patsy Ramsey were guilty of the murder of their daughter, JonBenét. But when I interviewed the Ramseys in 2000, they said the investigation had been bungled. The police, they said, had been unprepared because you don't see a lot of murder in Boulder.
Boulder, Colorado is like an island. Boulder bought up the land all around it because it has wanted to keep itself separate from the rest of the world in a way.
Boulder was a peaceful place. In 1995, there had only been 3 murders. In 1996, none. The police department had almost no experience with murder or kidnapping, and they fumbled key parts of the investigation.
This investigation was the equivalent of the Keystone Cops. Not only that, JonBenét Ramsey was found on December 26th, the day after Christmas, and a lot of people were on vacation, including the one person who had attended a course on kidnapping with the FBI. So the one person who knows anything is on vacation.
From the beginning, the police did not follow the established protocol for kidnappings.
There's a ransom note. That ransom note says, don't call the police. But what do the police do? They drive up in marked cars and park right outside of the house. They allowed people to walk all around the house. They allowed someone to clean the counters and clean off a bowl of pineapple was there. Now, why is that critical? Because JonBenét was found with pineapple residue in her stomach.
The Ramseys claimed they had not given it to her, but that raised another question.
Who gave her that pineapple? Was it the intruder that may have killed her? But it was gone because the police allowed people completely contaminate that crime scene.
Another mistake. The police had John Ramsey and his friends search the house themselves, possibly disturbing evidence. But lead detective John Eller was defensive.
What led you to the basement?
I'm not going to comment on how the body was found.
The FBI offered to help, but Eller refused.
John had an ego, and nobody was going to tell him how to do anything.
During the investigation, the police discovered male DNA on JonBenét's underwear and a palm print on a door. They could not trace the DNA or print to anyone, including members of the Ramsey family. The police thought if they could get the Ramseys to talk, they could crack their story. After months of refusing, the Ramseys came in for an interrogation in April of 1997 and again in June of 1998.
When she's first being interviewed by the police look at her and they say, you know, you're lying. And she kind of looks at him and she says, what do you mean I'm lying? She says, well, we have the evidence that tells us that you killed your daughter.
I'm talking about scientific evidence.
I don't give a flying flip how scientific it is. Go back to the damn drawing board. I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it, and we didn't have a clue of anybody who did do it.
You see, that's the strength of the woman. So what you have here is a strong woman and a strong family that stood up to the police department.
When I interviewed the Ramseys in 2000, they were furious about the way the police had blundered. Why don't you trust the Boulder police?
We know they have no experience in this. They refused help. They drew their conclusion on December 26th, 1996, and have been trying for 3 years to prove it.
In addition, every time we did talk with them, our police interviews ended up the next day in the newspaper. There's talk about a leak in the dike. There was a big hole in the dam of the Boulder Police Department.
Each of you has spent how many hours of actual interrogation?
I wrote a letter to Alex Hunter at one point when I was very frustrated, the district attorney. And I said, we will meet with your investigators anywhere, anytime, any place. The myth that we didn't cooperate is nonsense.
John and Patsy Ramsey were the last people you would think would be accused of murdering their child. John had grown up in Nebraska. He had an idyllic Midwestern childhood. He was divorced with 3 children when he met Patsy.
I'm a junior at West Virginia University.
Patsy was a former Miss West Virginia. They married and had Burke in 1987 and John Benet in 1990. John started a computer company in his basement. It became so successful that Lockheed Martin bought it for tens of millions of dollars in 1991. John and Patsy moved to Boulder, where Lockheed was located. That seemingly golden existence was interrupted by calamity twice. In 1992, John's 22-year-old daughter Beth, from his first marriage, was killed in a car accident. Soon after, Patsy was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, which is usually fatal. She underwent chemotherapy and was declared cancer-free. It was after the diagnosis that Patsy began to enter John Benet into beauty pageants. What we saw was a child dressed like an adult, very suggestive in many of these pictures. To many people, this looks perverted. Therefore, there's got to be something wrong here.
There is something wrong here if someone thinks that looks perverted. Jean Benet was an entertainer. She would entertain at the drop of a hat. I think it's just because the photographs were so available and so beautiful that it took on a life of its own.
Those videos were not intended to go outside of the family. They were family pictures.
Home movies.
They were home movies.
You did not release those videos?
Absolutely.
No.
In fact, despite the perception of their guilt, the police could not find any physical evidence linking the Ramseys to the crime. After months of investigation, Boulder DA Alex Hunter lost faith in the Boulder police. He brought in a legendary detective, a man who had solved hundreds of murder cases, Lou Smith. Studying the crime scene photos, Smith noticed several odd pieces of evidence that pointed away from the Ramseys and toward an intruder. On the path around the house, there were many spots without snow. An intruder could have gotten into the house, leaving no footprints. The grate that covered the basement window well had been moved, and the grass around it disturbed. There was a smudge on the wall underneath the open, broken window in the basement where a suitcase had stood. Smith also noticed 2 marks on John Benet's back that matched 2 marks on her face. The marks exactly matched the prongs of a stun gun. Smith reasoned that an intruder would have used a stun gun to immobilize and silence John Benet to get her down to the basement. Finally, Smith studied John Benet's injuries. John Benet had been strangled. She had also been hit hard enough in the head to deeply fracture her skull. The coroner couldn't tell which injury was the mortal one, but the police thought the first wound was the head wound. They had come to believe that Patsy had hit John Benet in anger and fractured her skull. Patsy, they said, had then strangled John Benet and staged everything to cover up the crime. But Smith said that couldn't be true. If John Benet had been hit in the head first, there should have been copious bleeding in her brain, but there wasn't. That meant that she had been choked to near death and then hit. The police theory couldn't be true, said Smith. The Ramseys were innocent. However, the Boulder police disregarded Smith's deductions, and the pressure to indict the Ramseys grew.
Cops said, arrest them, there's enough probable cause, and the DA's office said, there's not enough probable cause. We're not going to arrest the Ramseys.
But eventually the pressure grew too great. 2 years after John Benet's death, a grand jury was convened to investigate the Ramseys. The Ramseys braced themselves for more bad news. In the spring of 1998, you heard that a grand jury was going to be convened, and if they found reason, one or both of you would be indicted. Did you think you would be indicted?
We were fully prepared mentally to be indicted.
Our attorney said at the end that they really didn't know. They really didn't know what was going to happen.
I interviewed John and Patsy Ramsey in 2000. For over 3 years, they had been on trial in the court of public opinion for the murder of their daughter, John Benet. Their ordeal intensified when a grand jury met in September of 1998 to decide if there was enough evidence to indict them. The grand jury reviewed the case for a year. On October 13th, 1999, the verdict was announced. Did you think you would be indicted?
We had to prepare in the event the worst happened. And that is a daunting thought. I mean, when you're packing your suitcase saying, well, what does one take when one might end up in jail? It's a little scary.
The grand jury investigation, however, did not result in an indictment.
The Boulder grand jury will not return. No charges have been filed.
But not everyone was convinced that the Ramseys were innocent, including the governor of Colorado.
If I could speak to John and Patsy Ramsey, I'd tell them to quit hiding behind their attorneys, quit hiding behind their PR firm, come back to Colorado, work with us to find the killers in this case, no matter where that trail may lead.
Governor Owens did what should happen to no one in a civilized society. He held up his finger, tested the political winds, and for political gain said, oh, don't worry, we're going to get him. That's disgraceful.
Do you understand why it is that so many people still think you are guilty?
I understand that they've been told that by the media for 3 long years. I'm amazed that the whole world doesn't think we're guilty.
Let's start at the beginning. Christmas Day, you went out, you saw a friend, you came home around 9:30. What happened?
JonBenét was asleep when we arrived home. We took her to bed and went to sleep.
You took a melatonin pill, so you slept soundly?
Unfortunately, I did.
7 hours after the police first arrived, it was now around 1 p.m., the police asked you and a friend to search the whole house again. At that point, you opened the door to the small room. Tell me about it.
I knew instantly what I'd found. I found my daughter. And
what did you see?
I saw her lying on the floor with a white blanket. She was lying on a white blanket. The blanket was wrapped around her. Her hands were tied above her head. She had tape over her mouth.
What did you do when you found your daughter?
I immediately knelt down over her, felt her cheek, took the tape off immediately off her mouth. I knew I'd found her, but I started to feel very quickly that things were not all right.
When you say not all right,
her body was
you felt she was dead. Did you scream?
It was like a dream when you scream, but you can't say anything. All you can do is scream. That's what I did. I took her upstairs and laid her on the floor and still had a hope that she was alive.
Mrs. Ramsey, there is your child. It's hard for me to say, how did you do? How did you behave? It's reported that you prayed to God and asked Jesus to raise your daughter as he had raised Lazarus. Do you remember what you said, what you did?
I remember walking in and seeing her lying there in front of the Christmas tree. And I looked at John and he said, she's dead. And nothing felt real. I felt like it was, my life was in slow motion and this was not really happening. And I knelt down over her and just laid my body on her body and my cheek against her cheek, and it was cold. And Father Rawl was there, and he started saying the last rites, I believe, and I just kept saying, no, ask God to raise her.
You were both on medication. Do you think this might have affected the way you appeared?
I'm sure it did. You are so crushed and so devastated that you don't want to live, and you will do anything to numb that feeling. But I will also tell you, my experience is that tears don't come until later. I didn't cry when I received the call that my daughter Beth had been killed in an accident. I was angry. I was distraught, but I didn't cry. I cried later.
Let me talk about some of the evidence that some people may not know about. DNA was found on JonBenét's panties. This DNA does not match yours, your son's, any member of your family, or indeed anyone whom the police have questioned.
And that's That's what gives us hope that we can find the killer.
You think that's what shows that you're innocent?
I think that will lead us to the killer.
This was a particularly brutal and vicious murder. According to the autopsy, your daughter was strangled to death, and the noose was deeply embedded in her neck. It is a very vicious murder.
Yes. This was a monster that killed our daughter.
And the police think that it's you.
And that is the tragedy. They have thought it was us from the 26th of December, before even looking at all the evidence. That's the tragedy of this whole investigation.
In 2008, advances in DNA technology made it possible to test a DNA sample found on JonBenét's clothing, and it cleared any member of the Ramsey family. The Ramseys were officially exonerated, but back in 2000, of course, that hadn't happened. So I had to ask them a question that I wished I hadn't had to ask. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, I am now going to ask you the questions that a great many people want to know. Mr. Ramsey, did you kill JonBenet?
No, I did not.
Mrs. Ramsey, did you kill your daughter?
No, I did not kill my daughter.
How do you feel when I ask you these questions?
Insulted, pain, hurtful. How can I tell you how much I love my daughter? I love her from the depths of my being.
It's the kind of question you never would expect to ever be asked.
I'm sorry I had to ask you, but you know I did. Mm-hmm. This was a very brutal murder, and yet some of the authorities have said that you staged this.
Well, that's absurd. The garrote was deeply embedded in JonBenét's throat. Her skin was deeply indented by the cord around her wrists. And to say that we accidentally murdered our daughter and then staged this?
It's just unimaginable.
You know, people have said these are the two major motives. Either you sexually molested her or you snapped because primarily...
Let me tell you something. I'm a cancer survivor of stage 4 cancer. John has lost a child in an automobile accident. We just said that that completely changes your outlook. When you are standing on the brink of death with a terminal illness, your priorities suddenly line up in a row, and you know exactly what the important things are in life. I love my children. I wouldn't harm them for anything in the world. Now, I don't know how you answer someone that continually accuses you of some absurd notion.
You willingly gave saliva tests, yes? Blood tests?
Yes.
Fingerprints?
We gave police everything they asked for.
If the murderer was a pedophile, a sexual predator, do you ever reproach yourself for letting JonBenet appear so publicly in pageants and parades where she could have been seen?
Well, I think that is probably one thing that if had to do ever again, would be much more cautious about.
There's no question we were naive. We were ignorant of the fact that there were evil people in the world. We assumed we were living in a little town, a little nice, peaceful town, and that evil existed elsewhere. We were naive.
This tragedy was a meal ticket for tabloids, a feast for them. You've said that you were under siege.
We've been under siege for almost 3 years. Hidden cameras were planted at the gravesite.
How did you get through all of this? The reports, the constant television, the lies.
Barbara, I have lost the most precious thing in the world to me. I've lost my child, my little girl, JonBenet. I have been as low as you humanly can go. You can kick me when I'm down, but you can't take me any lower because I'm hurt as badly as I can be hurt. You can't go any lower than that.
Did either of you ever consider suicide?
I have to admit that yes, I did.
You did too?
Yes.
When?
Early on, I think when there is this heavy, heavy feeling in your heart and you feel like you can't breathe. You don't want to live. It's too...
The pain you want to escape from.
It's too hard. But we have other children, so we have to be strong for them.
A good friend of ours told us something that stuck with me. He said, for a while, the memories will bring pain. And then eventually the memories will bring smiles and joy. And we're at the point now where memories of JonBenét bring us smiles and bring us joy.
Do you dream about JonBenét?
Yes, I do.
What do you dream?
I dream, my dreams are so vivid that I feel like I've spent the whole night with her. And when I wake up in the morning, then I realize that the day is the nightmare, because I've had such a wonderful, lovely time with JonBenét all night long. Then when I woke up, the realization that that was a dream was so sad.
You were carrying something when you came in. What is it?
My sleeve. Just a little glove.
A glove that was JonBenét's?
Yes.
Do you carry this all the time?
I usually have something of hers with me all the time. I found this just recently when I had opened some boxes for the first time that I hadn't seen since we left Colorado. And, to think that her little hand was in this glove, and there's a little spot here where she obviously spilled something, and it makes me sad that there were happy little hands in this glove.
So the memories bring tears to your eyes, but you're also a little more at peace?
I don't know. I don't think I will be at peace until we find out who did this.
Let's stop now.
It's okay. JonBenét's okay. She's with us.
I first interviewed the Ramseys back in 2000. I sat down to talk with John Ramsey again recently. During the intervening years, his wife Patsy had died of cancer, and there had been other changes in his life too. One thing had not changed. JonBenét's killer was still unknown. Do you think the murderer will ever be found?
I sort of do still. I think we have two ways that'll happen. It'll either be a DNA match, or someone who knows something will become angry or bitter against this person and will tell.
In 2006, an Alabama school teacher named John Mark Carr confessed to the crime.
I love my JonBenét, and she died accidentally.
Carr, then in Thailand, was extradited to the U.S., but the DNA didn't match. It wasn't him. However, soon after JonBenét's murder, there had been an incident that could have led the police to the killer. There were things that were not looked at. Tell me about those.
Well, there was one in Boulder about 6 or 9 months later. It was very similar. Intruder went into the house when the parents were gone. Parents came home, went to bed, and fortunately found the intruder in their daughter's bedroom and frightened him off.
Did they find this man?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think this man might have been the same intruder?
I think it ought to be looked at very hard.
Yeah, it's a little late.
It's
unfortunately
too late. In fact, the conclusion of the police at that time, the police chief, was that, well, it's not the same because the little girl was not murdered.
You think the killer is still out there somewhere?
He's either out there dead or in prison. And I think if he were in prison, there's a higher likelihood now that his DNA would be in the database, the national database. What I've been advocating is that anyone arrested for a felony should be DNA printed, just like they're fingerprinted. I was told by a chief of police that if we had such a law in place in this country, nationwide, we would solve 1,000 murders overnight.
JonBenét would have been 25 this year. That's hard to believe. Do you think about what kind of a woman she would have been?
Mostly I think of her as a 6-year-old child that I remember.
In 2006, John suffered another loss. Patsy Ramsey died after fighting ovarian cancer for 4 years. It was not until 2008, 2 years after Patsy's death, that the Ramseys were officially exonerated, and the Boulder District Attorney apologized to them. Patsy went through all of that without knowing that she'd been cleared.
That's correct. But Patsy was a very strong woman.
I remember. Tabloids at the time accused your son Burke of the murder of his sister. Was he aware of that?
We tried to shield him from that. Friends would ask us, what can we do to help? We said, well, next time you go in the supermarket, call the manager over when you see our child's photo on the front cover and ask him to remove it. A lot of them did that.
There have been other consequences to having been the center of a violent, highly publicized crime. After John Bonet's body was found, the Ramseys never set foot in their house again. They decided to move back to Atlanta to be close to family. So John left his job, but they had problems financially. Before John Bonet's death, you were reportedly worth millions of dollars. But that money seems to have gone.
I was told by a very experienced FBI person that most victims of violent crime end up broke. It's very expensive to deal with, the justice system. You make bad decisions. You sell your home, you move, you quit your job, you change job. When something really tragic happens in your life, put your life in park. Give your checkbook to a trusted friend. Avoid making any big decisions because you're just not capable of making good decisions.
You tried to get a job after John Bonet's death, and you found it very hard.
I had one company that I talked to who said, you could really help us, but we can't afford to have our company's good name on the front of the National Enquirer, so we can't hire you. And so that was it was kind of a gray cloud that I would carry around with me.
At this point, is it in the past?
It's never totally in the past. You never get over the loss of a child. You move on.
When you see a 6-year-old playing in the park, do you do you get catch in your throat?
Yeah, a little bit. Particularly if they're a little girl and blonde hair. And
John Bonet at one point won a medal for being in the pageant.
Mm-hmm.
I understand you carry it with you.
I do. Carry it with me all the time.
Can I see it?
Yes.
You have it now?
Within a couple of days after John Bonet died, I really wanted to have something of hers. And this medal was what I wanted. My sister-in-law went to the house to get us some clothing and came back. And she said, John, I was going by John Bonet's room and I just felt that I should go in there and bring this to you. And I hadn't told anybody about it. And that was the most significant thing I wanted. So I just felt that was a sign.
You have written a book called The Other Side of Suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You've certainly gone through enough suffering. How do you get through it?
There's a number of elements that I think you have to come to grips with. One is forgiveness. That's a big one.
Forgive yourself or forgive
for
the
both.
perpetrator?
Both. Why couldn't I have protected my daughter? Why didn't I check the locks better in the house? The other aspects, the killer, the police, all the people you have to forgive, that's a tough bridge to get over. And the other is, you've got to have hope in your life. A good friend asked me once after all this happened, he said, John, do you believe the best days of your life are in front of you? And I said, no, how could they possibly be? He said, well, you need to get to a point where you believe they are.
And so what you have been able to hold on to is what? Hope?
You have to have hope. We all have to have hope for the future. And wrestling through, well, how do I establish hope again in my life when I've lost 2 children, a wife, my life savings, and you refocus on what really is important in life, and that takes a while.
John and Patsy's son, Drew, is now 28 years old and develops computer software. In 2011, John remarried. His wife is Jan Russo, a clothing designer. They met through friends. John works with an air charter and touring company in Utah, and they spend a great deal of time traveling and visiting family. John's new wife, Jan, joined us. Were you worried about having a relationship with him? This man who had gone through so much?
I was slightly concerned, but John won me over.
I can understand why. Despite all this sadness in your lives, you've managed to have a good life. Mm-hmm. Tell us how you accomplished that. What do you tell yourselves?
Well, I used to worry about things. It didn't matter how good things were going. I'd find something way out there to worry about. And then the worst thing that could have possibly happened that was not even on my radar happened. So I realized that all this worrying was silly. You're going to have enough problems for today. And it just focused you on enjoying the moment. That was a big part of, for me, how I could do it.
John Ramsey will always be associated with the terrible murder of his daughter, John Bonet. But I will think of him, too, as a man who faced the worst of life and found a way to go on. For Investigation Discovery, I'm Barbara Walters.
I wanna be a cowboy sweetheart. I wanna learn to rope and to ride. Out on the plains and the desert. Out on the great divide. I wanna be the giant town. The sun sinks in the west. I wanna be a cowboy sweetheart. That's the life of that.
And that concludes this evening's episode. But I would like to thank everyone for joining us here at One Solved Mystery, and ask if you are enjoying the programming, please comment below and consider hitting the like, subscribe, and notification bell, all of which help the channel out quite a lot. And I hope to see many of you next Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next live premiere of
You may be able to help solve the mystery.